So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course titled Trauma and Literature. We're looking at Kurt Vonnegut's novel Slaughterhouse-Five. So this is the penultimate lecture on that text. We will finish this text in the next session. So we're looking at the essay, which is a pretty comprehensive coverage of the novel, especially in the way we're reading it, because we're reading it from the lenses of trauma studies and the relationship between trauma and literature, the intersection between trauma and fiction, and how, if you remember, the point in which at which we ended last time is that despite playing with time, space, despite having this sort of magic realist elements, this is also a profoundly political novel, and it does refer to several political moments in history, American history. So, for instance, if you remember, this should be on your screen at the moment, the final bit with which we ended the last session, where there's a clear reference of how the novel refers to the assassination of Martin Luther King, J.F. Kennedy. These are people who are championing the cause to stop the Vietnam War, and how, as an anti-war novel, this is a profoundly political novel. We're also using some very experimental techniques of magic realism, fantasy, play with space and time. Now, if you remember, we were also looking at the relationship between masculinity, trauma, and fiction in this novel, and how the whole idea of war masculinity is deconstructed. And what we see instead is, this war, the Vietnam War, and almost all the other wars in the history of humanity have always sent young, immature, unprepared boys to fight in the battlefields, which has caused severe psychological damage, of course, deaths, untold deaths of young men who died brutally, were killed brutally. And then people who just came back also continued to live in a very damaged psychological condition. And it is exactly this damaged condition that is being referred to in this novel over and over again. And that connects to the question of unreliable memory, that connects to the question of inauthentic memory and the relationship between memoir and fiction, and how that sort of problematic borderline gets played up in several situations. So what we're looking at, in other words, is a very complex relationship between masculinity, memory, trauma, and identity, right? And this particular novel, it really underlines that entanglement, it underlines the convergence of all these different categories. Very complex categories, as I'm sure you can imagine. Now, the child metaphor is very, very important in a novel, and there's a constant reference to this boy-child and children's crusade, something which is in the very subtitle itself, and also the fact that there's also a duty dance with death. So there is a dance macabre quality about the novel, and the irony, and of course the dark irony, the dark humor in the story is how these are men/boys who are duty-bound to dance with death, right? Of course, the war kills everyone. There's no winner in a war. And even if you're not physically killed, or you're psychologically damaged to the extent of being killed, and you come back from the war as a changed person, as a more damaged person, as a more nervous person, as a more hysteric person. And that experience of unreliability, that experience of incomplete control, is something which haunts you forever as long as you live, right? And that is the trauma. That's the real trauma of the war. Because what we're looking at here is something that we may have mentioned already before. That when we look at trauma, one model of trauma is to look at trauma as a big event model. Something big happens to you, something huge happens to you. It's an event in a sort of Alan Boyd kind of a sense, an event which changes you permanently, from which trauma emerges, from which trauma starts. So that's the inception point of trauma. But what is also more complex and perhaps more useful for us and more productive for us today, academically speaking, is to look at the dailiness of trauma, the lingering quality of trauma, how even after the big event happens and goes away, even after you survive the big event and you continue living, how the traumatic moments, the traumatic recursions, and the recursive quality of trauma, it begins to affect the dailiness of living, the everydayness of living. And it is exactly the everyday Quixotean quality about trauma which makes a novel like Slaughterhouse-Five so compelling, because it's not just about the big Dresden bombing which happened, which is of course there as very much as some kind of it's almost like a character in the novel, that entire event of Dresden bombing. We know from research, we know through biographical accounts how Vonnegut himself was part of that event. I mean, he was a prisoner in war. He was taken by the Germans, and which ironically saved him. And what that experience also awakened in his mind is the fact that the difference between friend and foe in wartime just disappears completely, because the people who come in to bomb where he was, where his own army, the Allied soldiers, the American soldiers, whereas people who protected him, ironically, independently, were the Germans who put him in a cellar. And it's exactly being in a cellar which saved him from being bombed. So, that what it produces is a very cynical understanding of war, and that cynicism stays on forever. The longevity of the cynicism is exactly what informs the quotidian quality of trauma, the everyday consumption of trauma. And that's something which we see happening in the novel. Now, just to come back to the child metaphor in this novel, how the child figure becomes the sort of the formative figure who encounters trauma, and he grows and becomes a more matured man, but who never quite matures, because a part of the child, a part of the boy man, it remains damaged forever due to this particular encounter. And it's exactly the damaged condition that the novel is trying to depict, with a sort of fractured sense of time, the sense of being unhinged in space and time. The character of Billy Pilgrim, for instance, is a classic case of being unhinged, something of a freak in space and time, right? And we were talking about in the the previous session, how time travel in this novel is not really an empowering act. It's not really an agentic activity. Rather, it's more of an emasculating activity. It's more of a disempowering activity. It takes away your agency. It takes away your power. It takes away your control, your cognitive control of space and time. That's exactly what happens. Now, just to come back to this essay, and this should be on your screen, just to refer to the 13th century concept of quest. This boy knights going out in quest as Christian soldiers, bringing glory and triumph to the Christian concept, the Christian kingdom. So that same concept of quest is replicated here, and obviously in a different setting. So the Children's Crusade, the 13th century campaign that manipulated youth to fight on behalf of Christianity, tragically ending in shipwreck or slavery, is a fitting metaphor for both World War II and Vietnam War, as thousands of young men were compelled to fight for a cause that ultimately left them alienated and adrift. Right. So what the war caused also was a sense of alienation, and the disillusion with the ideology, the disappointment with the ideology, this ideology of nobility, the ideology of noble masculinity, which was caused during the war, is exactly what is being referred to. Now, one must refer to the Vietnam War specifically aware, because it's a war which was a very inglorious war. It's not really a glorious war to protect anything. It was a war of invasion. It was a war which was deemed illegal, even during that war, even at the moment it was been fought. Even within the United States, there was a lot of resentment against the war. So it's never really an uncritical glorification of the war, even at that time. So there is that cynical, ambivalent, dark quality, this sort of guilty quality about the war, even during that time. And of course, it got consolidated with more political protests, with more international critique subsequently. So, these young men were compelled to fight a war for a cause which, ultimately left them, disillusioned and alienated. And that sense of alienation informs the trauma. It informs the quality of being shocked, the quality of being left out, quality of being abandoned. So Vonnegut quotes from Charles Mackay's 1841 history of the event. There were no doubt idle and deserted children who would generally swarm in great cities. So this is a reference to the 13th century crusade, which used children as soldiers, so these glorious soldiers who were sent out to fight. And it's interesting how that concept, of that experience, of that structure is reconnected and recontextualized in the context of Vietnam War. And interesting parallels that emerge out of those two events. There are no doubt idle and deserted children who generally swarm in great cities, nurtured in vice and daring, and ready for anything. Mackay alludes to both the bravery and naivete of the children, and this account will resonate later in the novel with the hubristic machismo of Roland Wary. staid courage of Edgar Derby, and bemused indifference of Billy Pilgrim. Now, this bit is the most interesting bit, the bemused indifference, right? And and that is what produces a dark comedy. That's what produces a nihilistic comedy, which we also see in the character of Wazarine in Catch-22. The idea of empty comedy, the idea of exhausted comedy, the comedy of exhaustion, which equates laughter with cynicism, with darkness, with violence, rather than with happiness, right? And that's something I've been mentioning for a while now, and which is what makes these novels more compelling, and more complex depictions of trauma and the traumatic subject, who laughs not because they're happy, but because they are exhausted, and that's the only sensory reaction left. That's the only sensory response available to these people. Okay, so McKay draws a line between history and literature, especially romance. The former reveals that the Crusaders, specifically the adults, were ignorant and savage men, while the latter portrays their virtue and magnanimity, the imperishable honor they acquired for themselves, and the great services they rendered to Christianity. So these are very much the Christian soldiers, the 13th century Crusaders. And the difference between history and literature is exactly this. I mean, history produces them or represents them as something different, as naive people who were savages, while literature written around that time about that even embellishes them as glorious, glamorous men. So history records, McKay affirms, while literature embellishes, and this embellishment is something that exactly Vonnegut moves away from. Now, Vonnegut, word for word, repeats McKay's analysis of how romance handles Crusaders, as a narrator tells of Roland Wary speaking unintelligibly of the sacrifices he had made on Billy's behalf. This reappropriation simultaneously aligns Crusaders with soldiers in both World War II and the Vietnam War, suggesting that all three were sent off on quixotic ideological quests, and unfortunately ill-fated. Now, this reference to Don Quixote is interesting and very, very compelling and telling, because those of you who read Don Quixote would know that it's a parody of romance. It's a parody of the Christian Crusader. Don Quixote is someone who's wants to appropriate or self-fashion himself into that model of the Christian knight, and Instoward Cervantes shows us as a parody of hollow mimicry of that knightly quest, which also in a way undercuts that uncritical consumption of knightly masculinity, military masculinity, etc. So there is that Don Quixote quality about Slaughterhouse-Five, as with Catch-22. And both novels rely on parody, both novels rely on pastiche, both novels rely on mimicry, hollow mimicry, in order to sort of compel or carry the point home in terms of how these soldiers, although there's a sense of self-fashioning, in trying to become the Christian knights, they end up actually being, slaughters. They're being fodders for slaughter, and that's a metaphor in the novel. It's titled Slaughterhouse-Five. They are actually sent to be slaughtered. They're sent to be consumed. They're sent to be, and this is this cannibalistic quality for the war. It just eats up all these young men, either physically or mentally, and they sort of end up being consumed, damaged in the heads, even if they are lucky to survive the war. Okay, but Vonnegut does not condemn Wary for his invocation of the Three Musketeers. Rather, it shows the extremes soldiers went to in the efforts to appropriate fictions of noble masculinity that would both help to explain their predicament and provide guidance on for how to navigate themselves through and out of it. Right. So the reference to this Alexander Dumas novel, Three Musketeers, that itself is a is a story about this knightly masculinity, chivalrous masculinity. There's an attempt in Vonnegut's novel by one of the characters, the character of Roland Wary, for instance, who wants to become like that, who wants to self-fashion himself into that noble masculinity category, noble masculinity model. Now, Vonnegut doesn't really critique it in a very monolithic way, in a very steadfast way. In fact, there's a lot of sympathy for characters like Wary, because they're trying to navigate, they're trying to make sense of where they are, how they are, who they are, by connecting themselves to some of the fictions about noble masculinity. Now, that is actually seen as very tragic in the novel. There are people who know that they are fighting a war which is very ambiguous, morally speaking, but they just have to carry out the rules, just have to execute the rules. And one way of doing that is to connect themselves conceptually and experientially and philosophically to the idea of noble masculinity that helps them sustain themselves in a war, but also gives them a model, some kind of a pattern to stick to follow in terms of navigating themselves in the war. Although Wary is one of the more unlikable, listless playthings in the text, he's sympathetic. His status as a self-appointed musketeer is a coping mechanism. After all, he's only 18 years old when he's shipped halfway around the world to battle for his country, his values, and his life. So this is what I meant when I said it's actually quite tragic, that these are boys barely in the 18s, barely out of the teens, who are trying to make sense of where they are and what they're doing. And one way they can sustain themselves is by connecting themselves to the fictions about noble, heroic masculinity. And so there is, someone like Roland Wary is not really laughed at in the novel. He's actually sympathized with, and we are also meant to sympathize with him as readers, because he's just trying to make sense of what he is doing, and he just wants a template before him, the sort of template of noble masculinity, which the Alexander Dumas novel offers to him. Right, and now there's a reference to the first chapter, and we read it in the previous session, if you remember, where Kurt Vonnegut appears as a writer, and it's very, very metafictional because it draws attention to itself as a process of writing, and it starts off sounding like a memoir, sounding like some kind of autobiography, and then of course from chapter 2 it begins to become fiction. So there's that interesting play of genres as well, which makes it even more compelling and more complex as a text. But there's a great deal of self-reflexivity in the opening chapter of Slaughterhouse-5, because like I said, it keeps drawing attention to itself. It keeps drawing attention to its own artificiality. There is an artificial work, it's an artificial story, and it's just trying to tell you a story which is unreliable. It's based on a very unreliable memory. There's almost nothing that you can salvage out of it, and it's just a weak, failed attempt, and it keeps flagging up its own status as a failed attempt to tell what happened in that Dresden situation. And of course, the reference to the otherworldly planet, the fantasy planet, pure work of fiction, and how that connects to Dresden, while also actually being a critique of the Vietnam War. So there's a sense of history. There is a sense of the present lived reality, that's the Vietnam War, and there is a sense of the otherworldly reality, an alternate model of reality, which is represented by the other planet, where this magic realist engagements happen. Now, all that self-reflexivity in the first chapter is obviously part of the narrative design, the way the novel is sort of designed as some kind of a story to be told, and there's a degree of staggered storytelling. The narrator is unsure, uncertain, and of course very, very aware of his unreliability as a narrator, which doesn't give him the confidence or the competence to tell what happened. And therein lies the position of self-reflexibility. That therein lies the ontology of self-reflexivity, which is what is represented and discussed here. In the self-reflexive first chapter, the narrative representation of Kurt Vonnegut discusses the difficulty that he had writing the book, which was over 20 years in the making because of the solemnity and extremity of the Dresden fire bombing, as well as the unreliability of his own memory. Right. So, on the one hand, this is an event of gruesome, grotesque tragedy, one of the most barbaric events in human history. So, it's obviously a challenge to tell a story about it, to write that into some kind of a memoir or even a novel. And what makes it even more complicated and more challenging is his own unreliable memory, because he's not quite sure if he remembers it correctly. And if you remember, when we read the first chapter, he goes on interviewing some of his comrades, some of his war buddies, and almost none of them seem to remember the little details of the event. They seem to have forgotten. So that idea of remembering, unremembering, and storytelling, that gets connected. And that adds the complexity to this entire novel, the entire work of fiction of the Slaughterhouse-Five. which is something just set up by the very opening chapter. So he tells his editor, Samuel Lawrence, it is so short and jumbled and jangled, Sam, because there is nothing intelligent to say about a massacre. I mean, what intelligent thing can I say about a massacre? And this is a point about a traumatic memory and narrative memory that I touched upon earlier. So, it's too traumatic as a memory to be reliable. It's too traumatic a memory to be put into a narrative shape, right? To give a sense of a coherent plot, which will progress, which will propel on its own, right? So there is that difficulty of converting the traumatic memory into a narrative memory, and traumatic memory is, of course, is more fluid in quality, it's more cognitively complex in quality, and it's more uncertain in quality, because the whole point of being in trauma is that you experience uncertainty, you experience your awareness, your knowledge of space and time. Your sense of space and time begins to disappear, begins to become fragile, begins to break, begins to implode in a certain sense. And to create or generate a narrative out of that is always a near impossible task. So there is that impossibility of converting narrative memory out of traumatic memory, which is what the novel keeps on referring to. And therein lies a self-reflexivity at the beginning. So indeed, the novel's terse sentences, fragmentations, and experiments in temporality have been hailed as hallmarks of his artistic accomplishment. His style, marked by concision and plain English, evokes Ernest Hemingway's efforts to write one true sentence. Right, so Hemingway advocates to writers to write one true sentence, is something which we find, as a constant effort in this fiction and Vonnegut's writing as well. Paring away an excessive adjectives, sentiment, and verbosity in favor of an attempt to achieve an accurate representation of reality, in Vonnegut's case, a horrific reality that defies explanation. So, that idea of bombing, something that comes and creates a massacre through a bomb. The dropping of a bomb just decimates everything. It decimates architecture, building, it takes away lives, and also takes away meanings as we commonly consume them. So how do you represent a massacre? How do you represent disappearance? How do you represent absence? That just becomes the most challenging aspect of this entire storytelling process. Now, one may in fact wonder why a novel that is so seemingly simple, at least at a sentence level, and admitted failure could have taken so long. Of course, the latter claim of Vonnegut that a novel fails and has to fail as false modesty. Reviewer Christopher Lemon-Haupt rebukes this claim in his 1969 review in the New York Times. He's wrong, and he knows it. Indeed, Lemon-Haupt was right, and in his 1981 autobiographical collage, Palm Sunday, Vonnegut himself graded Slaughterhouse-Five as A+. Rather, the difficulty Vonnegut faced in part was depicting the narrative of the Dresden firebombing in a way that could reach a wide audience without explaining away or shamelessly exploiting it for financial gains and literary recognition. Furthermore, wary of his faulty memory, Vonnegut draws attention to his concern that he will distort and romanticize the events. By bringing these issues to the forefront, he anticipates derisive criticism and admits the inherent difficulties in rendering the story honestly and without ulterior motives. Now, this is a very complicated scenario, because on the one hand, he's talking about a traumatic event, he's talking about a very horrific moment in human history, and he's also writing a novel about it. So there's a sense of failure, there's a sense of knowing that whatever he writes will just end up being insufficient and at best an approximation of what really took place. So there is that quality very much there. What complicates it further is the fact that he knows that this might bring him critical acclaim, this might bring him financial gain, and there's always this guilt about converting a trauma into something which will produce financial gain. But the last bit is the most interesting bit. I mean, why do you think, one wonders why Vonnegut takes such great pains to talk about how this novel is a failure, how unreliable his memory is, and how whatever he writes might just be an approximation of the reality that transpired. Now, by foregrounding all this, by highlighting all this, he's looking at the constructed quality of novel writing, the constructed quality of narrative design, which can never really approximate, which can never really authentically represent an actual event, right? So therein lies the failure of the novel. And therein lies in the admission of failure, the admission of incompletion. So that this is the important bit that I just want to spend a little bit of time with here. The fact that Vonnegut is just foregrounding the failure, is foregrounding the constructed qualities, foregrounding the unreliability, he's foregrounding the contrived quality of the whole representational process. That act of foregrounding is also an act of sincerity, an act of authorial sincerity or artistic sincerity. Is admitting and acknowledging and announcing the fact that this novel is a novel about a traumatic moment in human history, in the past as well as in the present, the Vietnam War as well as the Dresden bombing, both acts of barbaric violence. But then in trying to write a novel out of it, one must be honest about the fact that this can only be an approximation. This can only be an act of construction or reconstruction, right? So the lack of seamlessness in Slaughterhouse-Five, the lack of smooth running, fluid running in Slaughterhouse-Five is actually an artistic acknowledgement of the difficulty to write a traumatic novel, the difficulty in writing a novel about trauma, about a real experience of trauma. Right, so therein lies the artistic decision to foreground the self-reflexive quality of constructedness and failure, etc. Okay, so right, just skip a little bit, and then we'll just come to the bit about heroic masculinity and the historical renditions of heroic masculinity, military masculinity, and how it's just such a false notion, it's such a mythical notion, which is sort of fed and pumped as almost part of a propaganda politics during the war, just to seduce young men in to fight a war which is sometimes illegal in quality. So, and this should be on the screen. Vonnegut's examination of the Dresden fire bombing is not the novel's only critique of the American military actions in World War II. Another subtle yet key critique in the novel is the case of Private Eddie D. Slovic, the first soldier to be executed for desertion since the American Civil War. Now, this is a very complex situation where we have a soldier, Private Eddie D. Slovic, who was historically one soldier who quit the war, and he was actually court-martialed under the instructions of President Eisenhower. So he was shot to death for being a deserter. Now that obviously brings to the fore some very, very key ethical concerns about a war. What if I choose not to fight a war? What if I choose not to participate in bloodbath, not to participate or be complicit to violence in a way that makes me uneasy? And what if the soldier decides, out of that guilt, out of that conscience, to desert the war? That act of desertion, that act of assertion of agency, that I choose not to fight the war, that is very quickly criminalized in this case of this particular soldier, this historical soldier, Eddie Slovic. And Vonnegut refers to that in the novel in a fictional form. And of course, the history of the event, the fact that the American president actually ordered execution of the soldier simply because he stopped fighting, he chose not to fight, it really opens up a can of worms about the ethics of a war, about the ethical responsibility of, and the whole idea of the morality of violence or the immorality of violence. That all these very immediate moral, philosophical, existential, ethical questions come to the forefront. That's something which Slaughterhouse-Five also does in a very subtle way, right? So this is something we find. He was the first soldier, we are told, to be executed for desertion since the American Civil War. Slovic's death by firing squad in 1945 had been ordered by Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces, Dwight D. Eisenhower himself, President Eisenhower, as a warning to potential deserters about the consequences. The case was uncovered in William Bradford's Hewitt's 1954 book, The Execution of Private Slovic, which Billy reads in the novel. So, look at the beautiful intertextuality that Vonnegut is playing here. Billy Pilgrim, who was a reluctant soldier in the novel Slaughterhouse-Five, is reading the story of another reluctant soldier the private soldier Slovik, who was historically executed under the president's command, shot to death for deserting the war. So that intertextual rendition, it's a work of fiction, Slaughterhouse-Five, and inside the work of fiction, Billy Pilgrim was a fictional character, is reading another book about a real soldier who was killed in 1945. So that intertextual connection becomes very, very interesting, because in a way it also connects Eddie Slovik and Billy Pilgrim in a very intersubjective way. They almost become, in a way, alter egos of each other. They almost become extensions of each other in a very interesting, complex, and symbolic, and also experiential way. So Billy reads that novel inside the book Slaughterhouse-Five. So there is a direct, immediate intertextual element about the reluctant military masculinity. To execute Slovik, from Vonnegut's perspective, seems more a matter of protocol than justice. As he writes, his purpose was to maintain the discipline upon which alone an army can succeed. Slovik's personhood is stripped of him in the name of the cause, but mentioning Slovik in passing conversely highlights his case, a case President Eisenhower tried to suppress when Huey's book was published, and humanizes the war, right? So the act of humanization, the fact that someone can actually have an ethical dilemma about fighting the war, that is something that Vonnegut wants to foreground. Vonnegut wants to, highlight, and he's also saying that in a wartime, in a war situation, protocol takes precedence over morality, right? So protocol takes precedence over ethics, and that's the reason why the soldier was ordered to be executed by the president of the Allied forces, So, so that humanization of war is something which we find throughout Slaughterhouse-Five. Slovik's crime was not subverting American military action by revealing strategies or sabotaging their efforts. It was not wanting to serve, not wanting to fight, not wanting to die, right? So it's not as if Slovik was giving away a vital intelligence or strategic intelligence to the other forces, to the enemy forces. He wasn't doing that. He wasn't compromising the American military plan in any way. It was just an ethical dilemma. It was just an act of agency and not wanting to fight, not wanting to enact violence, not wanting to kill people. That was a decision. That was the psychological condition which informed his decision to step out of the war. So that was a human moment of hesitation and ambivalence, which is quickly criminalized as by military protocol. So not wanting to die, he didn't want to die in the war. He didn't want to kill in the war. That's the reason why he wanted to step out. But ironically, he was shot to death as a matter of protocol. The sadness of the situation, such a tragedy, really. The sadness of the situation, the sadness of a young man wanting to live his life in his own terms, humbles Vonnegut. But Slovik, like Billy Pilgrim, is a listless plaything. So they're just a pawn of a government's plan and an inevitable war. Right, so they just become a listless plaything. So look at the thingness in the character. There's no subjectivity. There's no subjecthood given to Slovik. It's just he's just a pawn. He's just an instrument who's played upon, who's just played with, who just gets bandied around during the war. So Vonnegut's opposition is not against war. That he realizes is futile, but against the treatment of men it incurs and the consequences for the young generation who are sent off unaware and scared to wage the battles manipulated by their elders. So I stop at this point in the session, but what's interesting is how the whole idea of trauma is connected to guilt, is connected to inability to act out your own will, is connected to an absence of agency. It just becomes a complex experience, trauma, especially in a wartime situation like this. So Vonnegut is sort of foregrounding that the moment of hesitation, the moment of ambivalence that the soldiers experience. These young men, barely out of the teens, who are just sent to fight a war by older men who are manipulating them from a political level. And that is the sadness, that's a real tragedy of the war situation, that soldiers from either side of the war, from both sides, they get killed. These are like young, inexperienced, immature men who can just get brainwashed into fighting a war that they know almost next to nothing about, right? So that is the ignorance of the war, that's a tragedy of the war. That is also, in a way, a travesty of what is considered to be military masculinity, noble military masculinity, which is something which is constantly critiqued in Vonnegut's novel at a very human level, at a very human ethical level. So I stop at this point today, and we'll just continue with this and have the final session on this novel in the next lecture. Thank you for your attention.